You have got to be kidding me. Hey guys, this is Neon, this is Clownfish TV, and I am like, what the hell is going on? Comic Book Resources put an article out there talking about 90s nostalgia selling comic books, which is not surprising to anyone who's been paying attention, that the 90s style of comics are selling comic books to old school collectors like myself, right? But the thing is that these same media outlets have spent the last 4 or 5 years taking a dump on comic book fans who wanted to roll things back to the 1990s, who wanted to roll things back to comics being the way they remembered them in their youths, right? A lot of YouTubers talking about how far the comic book industry has fallen since the 80s and 90s, and now we're all going to be like, yay, the 90s are coming back after we demonize all these artists who have very 90s styles. You know, for going to Indiegogo and trying to sell their 90s style books to comic book buying crowds. Unfreaking believable. But par for the course, because we've seen these same people turn on Kickstarter, we've seen these same people turn on Comixology. Everybody's turning on Comixology, but you know what I'm saying. Now they're going to lean into 90s nostalgia after they spent the last couple of years taking a crap on 90s comics fans and 90s comics creators. So we're going to talk about it. Before we get into it any further, please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, guys. Over 258,000 subs. Thank you so much for the support. We do talk about the comic book industry, having worked in the comic book industry for a number of years, not on Marvel or DC books, but primarily on licensed comics, Disney comics. And I've noticed that the 90s are coming back all the way around. The 90s are coming back. Of course they are, because we've already strip mined the 80s, and I've noticed a lot of projects being announced lately that are trying to roll the clock back. Marvel has XMen 92, but they're going to make sure that they shoehorn in the Krakoa storyline into X-Men 92. I'm like, oh yeah, this will be pretty cool. It'll be like Jim Lee's X-Men. Now we're going to do plants. We're going to do plants for sure in this one too. And now Comic Book Resources puts this article up today. 90s nostalgia is alive throughout the comic book industry. Are we going to talk about all the 90s style comic books that are smashing records over on Indiegogo? They're being demonized by some people in the comic book industry for that. Probably not. We're probably not going to talk about those. So, coming from CBR, Spawn creator homages a 90s phenomenon, and there may be more. There absolutely will be, because they're starting to realize that comics sold way better in the 80s, 90s, and their target demographic, you know, the one they've chased off the last couple of years, yeah, they were probably peak comic book collector in the 80s, 90s, myself included. The creator of Spawn, Todd McFarlane, is actively bringing back the 90s in his new Image Comics series, and both Marvel and DC are following suit. Of course they are. And honestly, they're probably looking at these Indiegogo campaigns being like, what do people want? Oh, 90s style art. Let's do that again. Todd McFarlane's Spawn has seen more success in the past year than it has in a while, showing that there's a lot of success and relevancy to be had out of the 90s icon. No shit. This success has also seen a litany of new spin-off titles launched, including a team book called The Scorched. While it might seem like a mere sales renaissance for a character from a bygone era. There's so much more to this than just Spawn. 90s nostalgia in general is gaining speed. 90s nostalgia in general is gaining speed, especially in comic books. No shit! This trend is seeing more characters from the era regaining prominence, and this is likely more than just a gimmick. It instead reflects a moving away from a similar zeitgeist in the 2000s, and it's just getting started. You don't say! The hundreds of thousands of dollars being thrown at 90s style comics on Indiegogo and Kickstarter wasn't any indication that this was a thing. The success of Spawn and The Scorch revitalizes the 90s. For much of the 2010s, Spawn was seen as a character whose best days were long behind him, having sunken on the sales charts eons earlier, like 10 years is eons earlier, eons. How old is this person? The character in his book would only briefly get bits of relevance again whenever Todd McFarlane returned to the comic book for some sort of anniversary issue. That's not untrue. The hype surrounded the 300th issue, but this time it actually stuck. Did it? I don't know. I've heard reports that there are tons of unsold Spawn comic books sitting on shelves. I don't know. They sold a lot to retailers. Let's put it that way. Spawn sales are currently through the roof, making what was once a 90s Image Comics relic into a commercial success once again. The same goes for its spin-off titles, including King Spawn, Spawn Universe, Gunslinger Spawn, Scorch, Spawn, Spam and Spawn, Spam, Spawn and Spawn. You get the idea. Spawn's face is Spam. The latter has an actual team of Hell Spawns facing insurmountable threats, giving McFarlane his version of the Justice League, the Avengers, and the X-Men. In fact, one of the covers for the book homages the iconic X-Men #1 from his friend and fellow Image Comics founder Jim Lee. McFarlane has hinted this is only one of many such covers, most of which will likely draw from the art of the 90s. Holy shit, 90s nostalgia is alive throughout the comic book industry. You don't say. 90s nostalgia is a big thing throughout all the comic book industry, especially Marvel and DC. The House of Ideas, the X-Men are once again the top dogs of their shared universe. Yeah, I don't like where they're going, but you can't get away from it. I'm like, yeah, let's roll the X-Men back to 1992. Now we're still going to do this storyline just in the 90s. This reflects what was going on both tail end of Chris Claremont's iconic run on the title, along with the rest of the 90s biggest stories, such as Age of Apocalypse, which there are all kinds of action figures being released from 90s era comics. In fact, they have a Transformer X-Men crossover figure. It's the jet, the X-Jet, and it transforms into 90s era Cyclops, and it comes with 90s era Wolverine and Sabretooth, because those are the versions of the characters most people remember because of the cartoon show. You know, and if Disney were smart, we know they're not very smart, but if they were smart, when they bring the X-Men properly to the MCU, they will give us those versions of the characters. You know, we want, you know, Gambit and Rogue and Psylocke and Beast, and we want those characters, and we're not probably going to get them. We're probably going to get whatever the current roster is. Venom and Carnage are ubiquitous today as they were back in the day. Yes, in fact, the Venom movies felt like a throwback, and it's fitting that they were both co-created by Image founders. This has left some of the other Marvel families of books, including the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, feeling like also-rans. Where was Carnage? I don't think Carnage was. I don't think Carnage was. Anyway, same goes for DC Comics, although it's to a somewhat lesser extent. No, let's replace all the beloved DC characters with diverse and inclusive stand-ins for no reason. They're talking about Wally West being the Flash again, etc., etc. Many of these things would indeed seem to be based on nostalgia, namely a type which is the reverse of what was occurring around 20 years ago. The 2000s saw a rise in Silver Age nostalgia with Hal Jordan and Barry Allen being revitalized, while Aquaman was retconned to once again having a more familiar Silver Age origin story. Now, instead of yearning for characters and concepts from that period of comics, creators are pulling from their own childhoods, many of which were definitely inspired by the era of an undead Al Simmons and his hellish chains. No, they're not. Creators aren't pulling from their childhoods. The creators are the same creators that were creating comics 20, 30, 40 years ago and were ignored for a good number of years. And now that these publishers are looking at the sales numbers and they're like, oh, hey, yeah, come back, old school fans. We've got what you want. We've got 90s era Venom. We've got 90s era Spawn. We're going to put boobs on characters again. Come back. Please come back, for the love of God. Don't go to Indiegogo or Kickstarter and buy those 90s era books when you can buy 90s books from us now. You know, we're just going to bastardize some of them, you know, but you can buy the 90s era books from us. I think they're starting to realize way too late, that they chased off their core audience, trying to find a new audience. And in reality, they needed to do both. They needed to expand the appeal of comics while also retaining their core hardcore readers from the 80s, 90s, and instead they chased them all off. They chased them into the arms of those no-goodnik indie comics creators who were giving them what they wanted. And I think it's too little too late. We'll see what happens. I don't know. I'm going to wrap this one up. Please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, guys. We'll talk later.